On her 30th birthday at a luxury restaurant, the mother-in-law handed over the divorce papers. A gift from the family. The husband recorded her reaction for his amusement. She thanked them, signed on the spot, and walked out. They had no clue what she had already uncovered. The air in the upscale restaurant felt thick, laced with the expensive scent of table flowers and the quiet anticipation that precedes major events. For Anna, that night was supposed to celebrate her turning 30, a milestone she hoped would usher in a new phase of acceptance and peace. Seated in the red velvet chair, she adjusted her simple yet elegant dress, one she'd chosen with care, feeling like a fish out of water in that aquarium of luxury. Across the table, her mother-in-law, Victoria, watched her with a thin, almost imperceptible smile, one of those that never reached the eyes and that Anna had learned to dread. Beside her, Robert, the father-in-law, maintained a stance of complicit neutrality, a man who had long ago surrendered his voice to his wife. And at her side, her husband, Michael, seemed to buzz with contained anxiety, his phone discreetly placed on the linen tablecloth, ready for action. The atmosphere was a spider's web, woven with threads of false cordiality, and a tension that Anna felt on her skin, but which, in her eternal hope, she attributed to the formality of the occasion. She didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't about celebration. It was about execution. Anna's life with Michael's family had always been a minefield of cruel subtleties. She was a teacher's aide in a small preschool in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, a job that paid little but filled her days with genuine purpose. The smell of crayons, the laughter of children, and the tight hugs at the end of the day were her refuge, the real world where she felt valued. For Anna, there was nothing nobler than helping shape a child's first letters and first dreams. It was work of patience, love, and invisible dedication that built the foundations of the future. But for Victoria, that world was a certificate of mediocrity. A kindergarten aide, she would say at family dinners, with an intonation that turned the profession into a veiled insult. The phrase was always followed by a theatrical sigh, as if uttering those words caused her physical discomfort. Michael, with his potential, graduated in engineering, working at a multinational. He deserves someone who can keep up with his growth, someone who adds value, you know. The word adds was always said with special weight, as if Anna were a liability, a burden her son carried due to some youthful whim or worse, inexplicable charity. At family gatherings, Anna's job was the elephant in the room, a topic Victoria made sure to poke with her rod of ironies. If a cousin announced a promotion in finance, Victoria would look at Anna and say, "See, dear, the business world is so dynamic, it demands so much." The sentence hung in the air, the implicit continuation being that Anna's world was static and demanded nothing beyond singing nursery rhymes. If a newlywed cousin talked about international trips with her executive husband, the mother-in-law commented, "How wonderful to broaden horizons, experience other cultures. It enriches the soul and, of course, the resume." Each remark was a poisoned arrow, shot with a smile on her lips, so any reaction from Anna seemed an overreaction, a lack of humor. Robert, the father-in-law, was a ghostly figure at these events. He just nodded, silently agreeing with his wife, his eyes empty of any personal opinion. He was Victoria's echo, the shadow that validated her cruelty with deafening passivity. And Michael? Michael was perhaps the greatest disappointment of all. At the start of their relationship, he seemed to admire Anna's passion for her work. He said he loved how her eyes lit up when she talked about the kids, but that admiration eroded under the constant acid rain of his mother's disapproval. At dinners, when Victoria started her show, Michael looked away, ashamed. He fiddled with his napkin, stared at the ceiling, at his own plate, anywhere but his wife's face, which sought a drop of support from him. He never defended her. Never said, "Mum, stop it, I love Anna and respect what she does." His silence was a daily betrayal, a tacit agreement that hurt more than Victoria's sharp words. Gradually, he internalized his mother's narrative. He started suggesting, subtly, that Anna should look for something more. "Honey, you're so smart," he'd say on the rare occasions they talked about the future. "You could take a civil service exam, try an administrative field. Think about the salary, the stability." What he called concern, Anna heard as shame. He didn't want her happier or more fulfilled. He wanted her more presentable, with a job title that sounded good in his family's social circles. The humiliation was constant, served in homeopathic doses at Sunday lunches, holiday parties, passive-aggressive comments that eroded her self-esteem like a drip wearing down a stone. Anna started feeling small, inadequate. She avoided talking about her work, gave vague answers when asked about her day. She shrank to fit into a space that Michael's family deliberately made smaller and smaller. The joy she felt at the preschool was overshadowed by the anxiety she felt coming home. The love she felt for Michael was constantly tested by his complicity in her devaluation. She lived in a state of permanent alert, trying to anticipate the next attack, the next joke, the next sigh of disdain. And amid all this, she felt profoundly alone, trapped in a family web that seemed determined to consume her entirely, leaving behind only an empty shell that met Victoria's expectations. That birthday dinner, in that expensive restaurant, was just the peak of a long and meticulous demolition process. Tired of being the target of jokes and silent contempt, Anna made a decision that would change the course of her life, though not in the way she imagined. If the problem was her lack of status, she'd elevate it. She gathered the savings she'd set aside for emergencies, sacrificed her few hours of rest, and enrolled in an evening education program at a private university. It wasn't Harvard or Stanford that Victoria idolized so much, but it was a step. It was an old dream, a way to validate her passion and maybe reach a new professional level that would finally silence the criticisms. Nights became a marathon of crowded buses, dense lectures, and late hours bent over books, with the smell of stale coffee in her hair and exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. She got home after 11, her body aching, but with a spark of hope in her chest. Each concept learned, each assignment turned in, each high grade on her report card was a small personal victory, a brick she laid in building her new identity. When she finally mustered the courage to share the news with her husband's family during a Sunday lunch, hoping for a shred of recognition, Victoria's reaction was a bucket of ice. Night school. Oh dear, what an effort, she said, with a tone of false compassion while slicing her filet mignon with surgical precision. But you know the job market is competitive. A degree like that these days guarantees nothing. It's just a piece of paper on the wall. She paused, dabbed her lips with the cloth napkin and continued looking at Michael. What your husband needs, and what every good family expects, is a wife with an elevated social circle, with connections, with a last name that opens doors. Not a diploma from some community college on the outskirts. The word outskirts was said with contained disgust, as if it were something dirty. Each word was a blow, delivered with the precision of someone who knows exactly where it hurts. That monumental effort, which for Anna was an act of courage and overcoming, was reduced to nothing. A pathetic attempt to fit into a world that, according to Victoria, would never accept her. Michael once again stayed silent, his gaze fixed on his plate, as if the food were the most interesting thing in the world. In that moment, Anna understood that it didn't matter what she did. It didn't matter if she became the best educator in the country, if she won a Nobel Prize. To Victoria, she'd always be the simple girl from the wrong side of town, the woman who wasn't good enough for her precious son. The fight wasn't to be accepted. The fight was to survive that constant rejection, and the energy to fight was draining away. Despite Victoria's brutal discouragement, Anna persisted. The university, which had once been a bridge to acceptance, became a personal fortress. Her mother-in-law's words, instead of destroying her, ignited a fierce stubbornness, a silent determination to prove, no longer to them, but to herself, that she was capable. Nights continued as a marathon of exhaustion and learning. She became a familiar face to the bus drivers on the line that took her home, the girl with the books who dozed with her head against the cold, sweaty window of the bus. In class, she absorbed every word from the professors, participated in debates with a passion that impressed her classmates, many of them young people who didn't yet understand the weight of a second chance. Anna wasn't there out of obligation or to fulfill a rite of passage. She was there to reclaim a piece of herself that Michael's family was trying to tear away by force. Her academic papers, blending Piaget and Vygotsky's theories with the practical, visceral experience of a daycare floor, received constant praise. "You have a rare sensitivity, Anna," one professor told her after a seminar presentation. "You don't just understand the theory, you feel it. Never lose that." Those words were a balm for the wounds opened by Victoria's criticisms. They were proof that somewhere her value was recognized. While her academic life flourished, her marriage wilted. Michael seemed increasingly distant, a stranger sharing the same bed. The support he never gave turned into poorly disguised irritation. He complained about her fatigue, the nights she came home too late to fulfill her wifely duties. He griped about the money spent on tuition and books, suggesting that investment wouldn't pay off. "You're killing yourself for a dream that might not even come true, Anna," he said one night, while she studied at the kitchen table. "Meanwhile, our life is on hold. My friends travel, go out to dinner, and us, you're always tired or studying." He didn't see her sacrifice as a joint effort for a better future, but as an obstacle to his present comfort. The complicity that once existed between them had dissolved, replaced by a resentment that hung in the air like a toxic fog. Anna realized with a dull ache in her chest that she was fighting on two fronts, against Victoria's open hostility and against Michael's corrosive indifference. The environment at the preschool, which had always been her safe haven, also began to change. The director, Mrs. Jenkins, a kind-hearted but overburdened woman, announced budget cuts. Classes got larger, supplies scarcer. Anna's job, already demanding, became Herculean. She stretched herself to give attention to 25 little kids, wiping noses, mediating toy disputes, telling stories, and still trying to apply the new teaching techniques she learned in college. The salary, already low, seemed even smaller against the superhuman effort. On particularly tough days, when a child cried inconsolably or she couldn't prevent a little one from getting hurt in a silly fall, Victoria's voice echoed in her mind. A job without a future, without recognition. In those moments, doubt assaulted her. Was she really on the right path? Was all that struggle worth it? The physical and emotional exhaustion was so great that, sometimes, she found herself crying silently in the school bathroom, a small space smelling of disinfectant, the only place she could crumble for 5 minutes before putting on a smile and returning to the classroom. And it was on a grey Tuesday afternoon, days before her birthday, that fate decided to intervene in a way she could never have imagined. Arriving home after a particularly draining day at school, she found the mail stacked on the entryway side table. Amid the utility bills, water statements, and supermarket ads, one letter stood out. The envelope was thick paper, cream-colored, with a discreet embossed crest in the upper corner. It wasn't a bill, it wasn't junk mail, it was official. Her full name, Anna Thompson Hayes, was printed in sober, elegant letters. The sender was a law firm downtown, a name she'd never heard. Her heart froze. The first thing she thought was some old debt she didn't know about, some legal trouble Michael might have gotten into. With slightly trembling hands, she sat on the couch, her college backpack still on her shoulders, and opened the seal carefully. The words she read transported her to a past she barely knew, shrouded in the mists of childhood memory. The letter spoke of her mother, Linda, who had passed away nearly a decade ago from aggressive cancer. Linda, the woman with the sweet smile and rough hands from endless work, who had raised Anna alone with the sweat of her brow. The lawyer, in formal and respectful language, explained that her mother had worked for over 20 years as a housekeeper and later as a caregiver in the home of an elderly lady, Mrs. Eleanor Harrington. Anna vaguely remembered the name. Her mother sometimes mentioned the employer, a lonely woman who lived in an old mansion and enjoyed hearing the stories Linda told. The letter continued, and each line seemed more surreal than the last. Mrs. Eleanor, who had passed away a few months earlier at 94, was a widow with no direct heirs. No nieces or nephews or close relatives the law recognized. In a will drafted years before her death, a document the lawyer attached in copy, the elderly woman had left a significant portion of her assets to the one person who, in her own words in the document, had shown her loyalty, affection, and care in her years of loneliness and forgetfulness, Linda Thompson. Anna felt the air leave her lungs. Her mother, an heiress, The woman who counted pennies to pay rent at the end of the month. It seemed like a joke, a cruel mistake. But the letter was clear, and the copy of the will, with the notary's stamp, seemed unquestionably real. And then came the final blow, the sentence that made Anna's world spin on its axis. Since her mother, the primary beneficiary, was already deceased, the inheritance, by right of succession, passed directly to her only daughter and legal heir. To her. To Anna. The shock was so intense that Anna had to stand and pace the small living room, the letter shaking in her hands. She reread the document 3, 4, 5 times. The inheritance wasn't a symbolic amount, a token. The list of assets attached by the lawyer was dizzying. It included the mansion itself, where Mrs. Eleanor had lived, a sumptuous property in one of the most affluent and tree-lined neighborhoods in Seattle, a place she only saw from the bus window on her way downtown. And beyond the property, there was a portfolio of financial investments, stocks, funds, treasury bonds, whose total value made her read the number several times to ensure she wasn't adding extra zeros. It was a fortune, an amount she couldn't save in 10 lifetimes with her teacher's aide salary. In that instant, seated on the worn couch of her rented apartment, with the world spinning around her, Anna felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the arrogant power of money that Victoria idolized so much, but the silent, deep power of choice. The power of independence. For the first time in years, she glimpsed a future where she didn't need anyone's approval, where her happiness didn't depend on being accepted by a family that saw her as inferior. She could leave that apartment. She could finish her degree without worrying about tuition. She could quit the school and start her own business, maybe a small daycare with the teaching method she believed in so much. She could travel, see the world. She could divorce Michael. The last idea hit her like lightning. She could just walk away. A wave of cold, cutting clarity invaded her. She would keep that secret. She wouldn't tell Michael or anyone. The revelation would be her ace in the hole, her trump card, the armor that would protect her on the battlefield ahead. She felt, with a visceral intuition, that the birthday dinner Victoria was planning with such zeal wouldn't be a celebration. It would be a trial. And for the first time she was going into a trial holding not just the truth, but the key to her own freedom. The days following the inheritance revelation were the most surreal of Anna's life. She moved through the world as if in a dream, performing her daily tasks on autopilot, while her mind bubbled with the magnitude of what had happened. The lawyer's letter and the copy of the will were hidden at the bottom of her underwear drawer. Inside a brown envelope, an explosive secret tucked under piles of bras and cotton panties. Several times a day, when alone, she opened the drawer just to touch the envelope, to confirm it was real, that it hadn't been a hallucination from fatigue. The weight of those sheets of paper was the weight of a new reality, one that scared and intoxicated her in equal measure. At school, while helping a student tie their shoes, or reading a story about an ugly duckling who discovers it's a swan, she felt a pang of irony. She was the ugly duckling in the story, and she'd just discovered a pair of magnificent wings hidden under her modest plumage. The discovery of the inheritance sharpened her senses in an extraordinary way. She began observing Michael's family with a clarity she'd never had before. It was as if a fog had lifted, revealing the stark, ugly outlines of manipulation and contempt that had always been there, but which her hope and love for Michael had prevented her from fully seeing. Victoria's insistence on organizing the birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant, for example, now sounded completely different to her ears. 2 days after Anna received the letter, the mother-in-law called. Her voice was an artificial syrup, sticky and fake. "Anna, dear, I've decided on the place for your celebration. A wonderful Italian restaurant, super exclusive. I want to do something special for you, an event befitting you, to mark this important date." Before, Anna would have clung to those words with desperate gratitude, seeing them as an olive branch, a sign that her efforts in college were perhaps starting to be recognized. But now, with the knowledge of the inheritance locked in her heart like a treasure, she saw the trap behind the kindness. The phrase, "befitting you," wasn't a compliment. It was the harbinger of a humiliation planned on a grand stage. Michael's behavior also became transparently suspicious. He, who barely remembered her birthday in previous years, suddenly seemed thrilled about the surprise party his mother was organizing. "You'll love it, honey." "Mom's going all out," he'd say, with a strange gleam in his eyes, an enthusiasm that didn't match the apathy he'd shown for months. He exchanged constant text messages with his mother and sister, smiling at the phone screen in a conspiratorial way. When Anna passed nearby, he quickly flipped the device like a teenager hiding a forbidden conversation. The complicity between him, his mother, and father-in-law was palpable. Robert, the father-in-law, in a rare show of initiative, also called her, under the pretext of confirming the address. "Your mother-in-law has prepared a big surprise, Anna. Looks stunning. You'll be moved," he said, and the smile in his voice was that of a satisfied accomplice, someone who knows the movie's ending and delights in the protagonist's ignorance. Anna agreed to everything, masterfully playing the role of the naive and grateful daughter-in-law. "Wow, Victoria, you didn't have to," she said on the phone. "How kind of you all, I'm so happy." Each word was a piece she moved on her own chessboard, a silent game only she knew was being played. While they plotted her ambush, Anna planned her defense, and her defense would be the truth. She contacted the lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a gentleman with a calm, paternal voice who treated her with a dignity she didn't receive in her own home. She went to his office one afternoon when she told Michael she'd have an extra class at college. The imposing building downtown, with its cold marble and silent elevators, intimidated her for a moment, but the feeling dissipated as soon as Mr. Thompson received her. He patiently explained each clause of the will, each detail about the investments, each step of the probate process. He spoke about Mrs. Eleanor, her mother's employer, describing her as a strong-willed but very lonely woman who saw Linda as a confidant, almost a daughter. "Your mother talked about you a lot to her, Anna," the lawyer said, and Anna's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Eleanor felt that by leaving this inheritance to your mother, she was somehow securing the future of the daughter Linda loved so much and sacrificed for. In that moment, the inheritance stopped being just money and property. It became a legacy of love, a final and powerful link to the mother she'd lost too soon. Leaving the office, with authenticated copies of the most important documents tucked in her bag, Anna felt like a different woman. The validation she'd sought for so long in Michael's family, and which had been denied her so cruelly, came from an unexpected source: the posthumous affection of a stranger and her mother's eternal love. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed to diminish herself to fit their petty world. The gratitude she felt was immense, but it also came with a sense of responsibility. She would honor her mother's memory and Mrs. Eleanor's generosity by living a full life, free from the toxicity that had nearly consumed her. The plan for the birthday dinner began forming in her mind, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of liberation. She wasn't going to war. She was going for her declaration of independence. In the days leading up to the party, Anna prepared like an actress, readying for the role of her life. She continued her routine, went to school, to college, took care of the house. But inside, she was in a state of absolute calm and focus. She observed Michael with an almost clinical distance, noting how he avoided her gaze, how his touches were perfunctory, devoid of any genuine affection. He was just playing a role, waiting for the moment to deliver the final blow. The irony was that she was acting too, and her performance was infinitely more convincing. On the eve of her birthday, he hugged her in bed, a hug that seemed rehearsed. "Tomorrow will be unforgettable, my love," he whispered in her ear. "Yes, it will," she replied, her face buried in his chest so he wouldn't see the determined smile forming on her lips. He thought he was saying goodbye to his poor, futureless wife. Little did he know he was saying goodbye to a woman who in a few hours would become richer and more powerful than he'd ever dreamed of being. The countdown to the night of reckoning had begun, and Anna, for the first time, felt she had total control of the script. The gift Victoria had prepared with such care would indeed mark a new life for Anna, but the final outcome would be very different from what the mother-in-law had planned in her most malicious dreams. The night of Anna's 30th birthday arrived with a velvet dark sky, speckled with stars indifferent to the drama about to unfold on Earth. Anna dressed with ritualistic care, a calm that was the antithesis of the storm brewing on her life's horizon. She chose a black dress, simple cut and fluid fabric, one she'd bought on sale months earlier. It wasn't designer, but on her body, transformed by new self-confidence, it took on a discreet and powerful elegance. She pinned her hair in a low bun, leaving a few strands loose to frame her face, and applied light makeup, just a deep red lipstick, as a point of courage on her lips. Looking in the bedroom mirror, she didn't see the tired, insecure girl from weeks ago. She saw a woman on the threshold of her own story, a sovereign about to claim her kingdom. In her bag, beside her wallet and phone, rested the brown envelope containing authenticated copies of the will and property deed. It was her weapon, her declaration, her passport to freedom. Michael waited in the living room, impatient, already dressed in a button-down shirt smelling of fabric softener and haste. "You look beautiful," he said, but his eyes skimmed over her without really seeing. The compliment was automatic, an item checked off a to-do list before the big event. He was more interested in his watch, the time, the logistics of the ambush. "Let's go. Mum must be arriving there already. She hates delays." During the car ride, a heavy silence settled between them. Michael drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, a nervous melody betraying his anxiety. Anna looked out the window, watching the city lights pass in blurs, feeling a strange peace. It was the calm before battle, the certainty of someone who knows their own power and that, regardless of the outcome, they won't emerge defeated. She no longer felt the need to fill the silence, to seek his approval, to decipher his mood. He'd become a secondary character in her own life, and she observed him with the distant curiosity of watching an actor on stage. The restaurant chosen by Victoria was exactly as Anna had imagined, ostentatiously luxurious. A valet in a starched uniform opened the car door. The interior was a sanctuary of questionable good taste, with crystal chandeliers hanging too low, flower arrangements that screamed their importance, and a murmur of conversations muffled by thick carpeting. Victoria and Robert were already at the table, a prominent one chosen for maximum visibility. Victoria stood to greet them, dressed in a raw silk suit that probably cost more than Anna's annual salary. She gave 2 air kisses, one on each side of Anna's face, her strong perfume invading her nostrils. "Dear, happy birthday, you look appropriate," she said, the compliment capped with a quick appraisal from shoes to hair, making clear that appropriate was the most one could expect. Robert just nodded, a vague smile on his face, already helping himself to a glass of red wine. The table was set for 4, but the energy there was that of a firing squad awaiting its victim. The dinner dragged on in a performance of normality. Victoria talked incessantly about her latest trip to Europe, about a friend's son who'd just passed the bar exam for a prestigious firm, about the real estate depreciation in less desirable neighborhoods. Each topic was an opportunity to draw a line between their world, the world of success, money, relevance, and Anna's. She asked Anna about college but didn't wait for answers, interrupting to tell an anecdote or call the waiter. It was a performance, a monologue designed to reaffirm status and diminish Anna before the coup de grace. Anna, in turn, ate slowly, savoring the expensive food that soon she could buy whenever she wanted. She answered questions with monosyllables, smiling serenely, a calm that began to disrupt Victoria's script. The mother-in-law expected an anxious, chatty daughter-in-law, desperate for approval. Instead, she found a sphinx, a tranquil and observant woman who seemed to be enjoying the show. Michael was visibly tense. He drank his wine too fast, and his phone, which he'd placed discreetly beside his plate, blinked with notifications he read sidelong. He was a poor actor, his guilt and anxiety overflowing in every gesture. He tried to bring up trivial topics about football, about traffic, but his words died in the air, swallowed by the tension emanating from his mother. He was a puppet in Victoria's theatre, and the strings were becoming too visible. At one point, when Victoria described in detail the presidential suite of the hotel she'd stayed in Paris, Anna felt a surge of pity for Michael. He'd traded the chance for genuine love and a real partnership for the approval of a mother who saw him more as a success project than a son. He was as trapped in that web as she was, the difference being he believed his prison was a palace. Finally, after the main course was cleared, Victoria signaled the waiter. It was time. "Well, I think the most awaited moment of the night has arrived," she said, her voice rising a notch, projected to reach nearby tables. "Anna's gift." She smiled, a wide and predatory smile, her eyes gleaming. Robert shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie knot, like a spectator preparing for the climax. And Michael, the amateur director of that tragedy, picked up his phone. He no longer tried to disguise it. He pointed the device openly at Anna, his index finger ready to press record. The discreet red light that would indicate recording wasn't on yet, but the intent was clear as the crystal chandelier above their heads. He wanted to capture the exact moment Anna's world crumbled. He wanted the close-up of her face contorting in pain and humiliation. He wanted the soundtrack of her sobs. With a theatrical gesture, Victoria pulled from her designer bag a rectangular envelope, pearlescent paper that shimmered under the restaurant's light. It was elegant, expensive, and completely devoid of any human warmth. "Anna, dear," she began, her voice a sweet poison. "We as your family thought long about what to give you. Something meaningful, something that represented a real change in your life, a step toward the future you deserve." She slid the envelope across the white linen tablecloth, stopping it right in front of Anna. The silence at the table was absolute. Conversations from surrounding tables seemed to fade, an indistinct hum in the background. Hannah's universe shrank to that table. Those three faces staring at her with cruel expectation, and the white envelope containing her sentence. Or, as she now knew, her emancipation. She looked at Victoria, then Robert, and finally Michael, who stared at her over the phone screen, his face tense with anticipation. She took a deep breath, not from fear, but preparation. The show was about to begin. And, for the first time, she was the director. The pearlescent envelope rested on the linen tablecloth like a promise of ice. Anna stared at it for a long moment, feeling the gazes of her three tormentors fixed on her, heavy as stones. The world around had dissolved into a blur of lights and murmurs. Only that table existed, that suspended instant in time. Michael, with the phone raised, finally pressed the button. A tiny red light blinked in the corner of the device, the Cyclops' eye now officially open, hungry for the image of her devastation. Victoria smiled, a macabre Mona Lisa smile, anticipated satisfaction pulling at the corners of her perfectly lined lips. Robert cleared his throat, a nervous sound that broke the tense silence. "Open it, Anna," he said, his voice a bit louder than necessary. "Your mother-in-law chose it with great care." The irony was so thick it could be cut with the fish knife still on the table. With a calm that surprised even herself, Anna reached out and took the envelope. The paper was smooth and cold to the touch. She didn't tear it open with the anxiety they expected. Instead, she ran her finger along the flap, peeling it back with deliberate precision, as if opening routine mail. The soft sound of the paper separating was the only noise in that vacuum of expectation. From inside, she pulled a stack of folded sheets. The paper was different, more ordinary, the kind used in offices. At the top of the first page, in bold, the header of a well-known family law firm jumped out at her, and just below, the words that were supposed to be her ruin: "Petition for contested divorce." Her brain registered the information without shock, without panic. It was exactly what she expected. Only the word "contested" added an extra layer of cruelty. They didn't want an amicable divorce. They wanted a fight, a war to subjugate her even more. She flipped through the documents slowly, page by page. The petition, drafted in impersonal legal jargon, cited irreconcilable differences and incompatibility of life projects. There was a clause about asset division, which was comically simple since the apartment was rented and the car financed in Michael's name. And at the end, the dotted line for her signature, a blank space waiting to seal her fate according to their script. As she read, she could feel the impatience growing at the table. That calm wasn't the reaction they'd rehearsed. Where were the tears? Where was the plea that, "No, Michael, please don't do this"? Where was the drama that would make Michael's video go viral in the family group? "And so, dear," Victoria's voice cut the air, sharp as a stiletto, "aren't you going to say anything?" left speechless by our generosity. The sarcasm was explicit now. The performance of the grateful daughter-in-law was over. Anna lifted her eyes from the papers. She didn't look at Victoria. She looked straight at Michael, at the man she'd once loved, who now filmed her with the coldness of a wildlife documentarian recording a prey's slaughter. In his eyes, she saw no hate, no sadness. She saw only emptiness, the final realization that the man she'd married no longer existed, if he ever had. And then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of crying, Anna smiled. Not a forced or bitter smile, but a genuine, serene, almost amused one that lit up her face and completely confused her adversaries. "A pen," she said, her voice clear and firm. "You thought of everything, I imagine." Victoria, caught off guard, hesitated for an instant. Then, as if regaining control, she pulled from her bag a designer pen, heavy and gold, and placed it on the table with a dry click. "Of course, dear. To make things easier." Anna took the pen. The metal was cold and heavy in her hand. She positioned the papers on the table, found the last page, the signature one, and under the stunned gazes of Victoria, Robert, and Michael, signed her name with fluid, elegant handwriting, Anna Thompson Hayes. The final flourish was one of pure, undeniable freedom. She didn't hesitate, didn't tremble. It was the most important autograph of her life. She pushed the signed papers back to the center of the table. Michael's phone wavered in his hand, the image shaking for a second. Victoria's forehead furrowed in an expression of complete perplexity. This wasn't in the script. The victim wasn't behaving like a victim. "Thank you," Anna said, and her voice resonated with a sincerity that left them even more disoriented. "This is, without a shadow of a doubt, the best and most liberating birthday gift I've ever received in my entire life." Victoria's jaw dropped, literally. Her mouth opened in a small O of shock, the mask of arrogance shattering into 1,000 pieces. Robert blinked several times, as if trying to focus on a scene that made no sense. Michael lowered the phone, completely forgetting his recording. "What?" he stammered, the word coming out as a breath. You're signing, just like that, without arguing." "Argue what, Michael?" she replied, and for the first time there was a touch of steel in her voice. "That you're cruel. That you plan to humiliate me publicly on my birthday? That you're a coward hiding behind your mother's skirt. There's nothing to argue. Just to state. And to thank. You've given me my freedom on a platter." And then, before they could recover from the first shock, Anna delivered the second, the masterstroke she'd guarded so carefully. With the same deliberate calm, she leaned down, opened her bag, and pulled out the brown envelope. It looked modest, almost poor compared to Victoria's pearlescent one, but it held infinitely greater power. She placed it on the table, beside the divorce papers. "Since we're having a night of life-changing gifts and big revelations," she began, and her voice now had a timbre of authority that made everyone at the table shrink, "I also have news to share with you." She paused, looking around. The nearby tables, which had been watching with curiosity, were now silent, completely captivated by the drama. The waiters stopped at a respectful distance. The entire restaurant had become her stage. "A few days ago," she continued, looking straight into Victoria's eyes, "I discovered that life sometimes has a poetic and wonderful sense of justice. I discovered that my mother's kindness and loyalty, qualities you never knew how to value and that were always a reason for your contempt, were rewarded in a way that you, in your obsession with status and money, could never conceive." She opened the brown envelope and pulled out the copy of the will. She unfolded the document and smoothed it on the table. "I received an inheritance," she announced, and the words rang like thunder in the restaurant's silence. "An inheritance left by my mother's old employer, an inheritance that includes," she paused, savoring each word, "a house in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in this city and financial independence that allows me never again, in my entire life, to hear from anyone that I'm not up to par." But the impact of those words was immediate and devastating. Victoria's face went from shock to disbelief and then to a cadaverous pallor. Robert swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his neck. And Michael looked at Anna as if seeing her for the first time. The phone fell from his hand onto the table with a dull thud, the dark screen now reflecting the stunned face of a man who just realized he'd thrown away a winning lottery ticket the exact moment the prize was announced. The wife he despised, the little teacher who embarrassed him, was now unbelievably an heiress, and he'd just signed the papers separating him from her and her fortune forever. The silence that followed Anna's revelation was deeper and heavier than any noise. It was a vacuum, a black hole of shock that sucked all the air from that table. Victoria was frozen, her mouth still slightly open, eyes fixed on the will on the table as if it were a snake about to strike. Her mind, so quick for malice and social calculation, simply couldn't process the information. The narrative she'd built for years of Anna as a pitiful intruder of inferior status had disintegrated in seconds, and what remained in its place was a humiliating reality. The daughter-in-law she'd tried to crush was now, by a twist of fate, richer and more powerful than she might ever be. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap she'd set with such care had closed on herself. Robert, for the first time, seemed to have an expression of his own. It was a mix of astonishment and an almost comic terror. He looked from Anna to his wife, and back to Anna, as if watching a tennis match where one player suddenly pulled out a cannon. He lowered his eyes, staring at his own lap, a defeated man finally realizing he'd bet on the wrong horse. His silent complicity, his convenient passivity, now cost him the shame of being associated with that monumental fiasco. Michael, meanwhile, was catatonic. The forgotten phone on the table was an epitaph to his stupidity. He looked at Anna, at the serene and strong woman before him, and the image didn't fit the fragile figure he and his mother had tried to create and destroy. The realization of what he'd lost, not the money but the woman he'd underestimated so deeply, began dawning in his mind with the painful clarity of a hangover morning. He hadn't just divorced an heiress. He'd revealed himself as a small, cruel, manipulated man, and all of it witnessed by an entire restaurant. And then the silence was broken. Not by anyone at the table, but by a solitary applause from a corner of the room. It was the waiter who'd served them, a young man with an attentive gaze who'd watched everything from afar. His applause was hesitant at first, then firm, and like a spark in dry straw, it spread through the place. A lady at a nearby table who'd clearly heard Anna's declaration started clapping too. Then her husband. In seconds, a wave of applause swept the restaurant. It was the other patrons, strangers who, even without knowing the whole story, understood the essence of what had happened there. They'd seen a woman cornered, and instead of succumbing, she'd risen with admirable dignity and strength. It was applause for courage, for the turnaround, for the poetic justice rarely seen outside movie screens. Anna felt her face flush, not from shame, but from overwhelming emotion. She looked around and saw the smiling faces of strangers, people supporting her, celebrating her victory. It was the purest, most unexpected validation she could receive. She stood, posture straight, chin up. She smoothed her black dress, a simple gesture that seemed to carry the full weight of her transformation. She looked one last time at the three pale, shocked faces before her. There was nothing more to say. Her victory didn't need a speech. Their silence, contrasting with the restaurant's applause, was the most eloquent conclusion. With a serenity that was her greatest revenge, Anna turned her back on the table, on the failed marriage, on the years of humiliation, and she walked. Each step out of that restaurant was a step toward her new life. The sound of applause followed her like a soundtrack to the door, a hymn to her liberation. As she passed through the revolving door and felt the cool night air on her face, she breathed deeply, air that seemed cleaner, lighter. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was where it should be, behind her, reduced to a memory of a poorly rehearsed play where the villains ended up as the clowns. Victoria's cruel gift hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the prologue. The real bestseller of her life was just beginning to be written, and for the first time she was the author. And so, with her head held high and the sound of victory echoing in her ears, Anna walked into the first day of the rest of her life. A story like this reminds us that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the cruelest packages, and that our truest strength blooms precisely when they try to bury us. I hope you felt moved and thrilled by Anna's journey as much as I did in telling it. Stories are the soul of our channel, and your presence here is what drives us to find and share these narratives of overcoming that touch us so deeply. Now, I really want to know your opinion. What did you feel with this plot twist? If you could rate Anna's courage from 0 to 10, what would it be? Leave it in the comments. I read them all and love seeing your reactions. And if you believe in the power of stories to inspire, to heal, and to make us feel less alone, I invite you to join our family. Give a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, whenever a new story like Anna's comes up, you'll be one of the first to join us on that journey. Thank you so much for your viewership, your time, and your sensitivity. See you in the next story.